Have you ever been in a conversation where someone starts talking about celebrity gossip, the weather, or their weekend plans, and you feel something almost violent happen inside you? Not anger exactly, but a kind of spiritual nausea, as if your soul is being forced to digest something toxic. You smile politely, you nod, but internally you're screaming, "Is this really what we're going to talk about? Is this what passes for human connection?" If you've ever felt this way, if small talk makes you feel like you're suffocating, if you find yourself physically uncomfortable when conversations stay on the surface while depths remain unexplored, then what I'm about to share will not only explain this existential revulsion, but reveal why Friedrich Nietzsche considered it a mark of philosophical greatness. Because according to the man who declared that God is dead and challenged every comfortable assumption of his time, your inability to tolerate superficiality isn't social awkwardness. It's the natural response of a deep soul forced to operate in a shallow world. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher whose insights into human nature were so penetrating, they're still reshaping how we understand consciousness, power, and authenticity, understood something that most people never grasp. There are fundamentally different types of human beings, not in terms of race or class or gender, but in terms of psychological depth. And for those cursed or blessed with what he called free spirits, contact with superficiality isn't just annoying. It's a form of spiritual violence that can trigger what he termed the great nausea. Today, we're going to dive into Nietzsche's revolutionary understanding of why certain people experience such visceral repulsion towards shallow conversation, surface-level thinking, and what he called the herd mentality. We'll explore his concept of the higher men, not as a claim of superiority over others, but as a recognition that some souls are simply built for depths that most people cannot or will not explore. This isn't about intellectual snobbery or thinking you're better than others. This is about understanding why your psyche rejects superficiality like a body rejects poison, and why Nietzsche believed this rejection is essential for human evolution. By the end of this video, you'll understand why your philosophical disgust towards small talk and shallow living isn't a character flaw. It's a sign that you're what Nietzsche called a philosopher with a hammer, someone destined to break through surfaces to reach the truths that lie beneath. You know that moment when someone asks, "How's the weather?" and something inside you dies a little? Or when a group conversation revolves around TV shows, sports scores, or office gossip, and you feel like you're watching life happen through a thick glass wall? Most people would tell you to lighten up, to learn to enjoy simple pleasures, to stop being so intense. But Friedrich Nietzsche would tell you something radically different. Your repulsion is a philosophical response to what he called the tyranny of the superficial. Nietzsche understood that most human interaction exists at what he termed the level of appearances, a realm where people exchange words without ideas, where they connect without truly meeting, where they live without really being alive. For most people, this level is not just comfortable, it's preferred, it's safe. It doesn't demand anything from them. It doesn't threaten their carefully constructed sense of self or challenge their unexamined assumptions about life. But for what Nietzsche called free spirits or higher types, exposure to this level of existence creates what he described as physiological repulsion, not just mental discomfort, but a bodily response to what the soul recognizes as spiritual poverty. When you're forced to engage with superficiality, Your nervous system doesn't just register boredom, it registers a kind of existential threat to your authentic being. This is what Nietzsche meant when he wrote about the great nausea, not physical sickness, but the soul's response to being surrounded by what he called the last men, people who have given up on depth, meaning, and authentic existence in favor of comfort, entertainment, and the endless pursuit of trivial pleasures. Your spiritual nausea towards superficiality is actually your inner philosopher recognizing that engaging with shallow content and shallow people requires you to betray something essential about yourself. Every time you pretend to care about meaningless topics, every time you laugh at jokes that aren't funny, every time you nod along with conversations that explore nothing, you're committing what Nietzsche would call a crime against your own becoming. But here's where Nietzsche's insight becomes truly revolutionary. He didn't see this existential revulsion as a problem to be solved or a social skill to be developed. He saw it as evidence of what he called noble nature, not nobility in terms of birth or wealth, but nobility of spirit. The capacity to be disgusted by superficiality is, according to Nietzsche, one of the clearest signs that you possess what he termed the will to power. Not power over others, but power over yourself. The strength to live according to your deepest values, rather than adapting to the shallow expectations of society. Nietzsche argued that civilization progresses through what he called the exceptional one, individuals whose psychological makeup makes it impossible for them to accept the comfortable lies and surface-level existence that satisfy the majority. These people don't choose to be different. Their very nature compels them toward depth, authenticity, and what he called the revaluation of all values. When you feel that philosophical disgust toward small talk, you're not experiencing social anxiety. You're experiencing what Nietzsche called the philosopher's sickness, the inevitable result of a mind that cannot help but see through surfaces to the emptiness beneath. Your discomfort with superficial conversation is actually your soul's way of protecting its capacity for what Nietzsche termed dangerous thinking, the kind of thought that questions everything, that refuses to accept comfortable assumptions, that insists on looking directly at truths that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. If you just recognized yourself in these words, if you felt that familiar mix of relief and intensity that comes from finally being understood, subscribe. Because you're not antisocial, you're philosophically awake. This is why forced participation in superficial social rituals feels so exhausting for people like you. It's not just that you find the topics boring, though you do. It's that engaging with superficiality requires you to suppress your natural inclination toward depth, to pretend that meaningless things matter, to collaborate in what Nietzsche called the great deception, the collective pretense that surface-level existence is sufficient for human fulfillment. Nietzsche understood that this kind of suppression doesn't just cause psychological discomfort, it creates what he called ressentiment, a deep spiritual poison that results from betraying your own nature to fit into social expectations. The terrible repulsion you feel towards superficiality is actually your psyche's immune system, protecting you from this spiritual poison by making it impossible for you to engage authentically with what your soul recognizes as inauthentic. But there's something even more profound happening here. Nietzsche believed that the people who experience this repulsion aren't just protecting themselves, they're serving an evolutionary function. They are what he called the conscience of their time. Individuals whose very existence challenges the comfortable mediocrity that most people accept as normal. Your inability to tolerate shallow conversation isn't antisocial behavior. It's what Nietzsche would call cultural work. By refusing to participate in meaningless exchanges, by demanding depth from your interactions, by living according to standards that most people find uncomfortable or intimidating, you're performing what he termed the sacred no, the rejection of everything that diminishes human possibility. This is why people often react strangely to individuals like you. Your very presence raises uncomfortable questions about their own choices, their own willingness to accept superficiality, their own fear of the depths that you navigate naturally. Nietzsche understood that higher types make others uncomfortable not because they try to, but because their existence is a constant reminder of possibilities that most people have given up on exploring. When you walk away from conversations that never move beyond the surface, when you choose solitude over social gatherings that feel empty, when you prefer reading philosophy to watching mindless entertainment, you're not being difficult. You're practicing what Nietzsche called self-reverence, the profound respect for your own nature that refuses to be compromised by the expectations of those who have settled for less than authentic existence. Nietzsche wrote extensively about what he called the problem of the actor, the way most people live their entire lives performing roles rather than developing their authentic selves. For these people, superficial interaction isn't just comfortable, it's essential. It allows them to maintain their various masks without ever having to confront the question of who they really are beneath all the performance. But for individuals with what Nietzsche called philosophical nature, this kind of performance is impossible. Your existential revulsion towards superficiality is actually evidence that you've maintained what he termed intellectual honesty, the refusal to pretend that shallow things are deep, that meaningless things are meaningful, that surface-level existence is sufficient for human flourishing. This intellectual honesty comes at a cost. Nietzsche was brutally clear about this. He wrote that those who insist on depth in a superficial world will experience what he called the loneliness of the exception, not because they choose isolation, but because their very nature makes them incompatible with most of what passes for human connection in ordinary social life. But this loneliness, according to Nietzsche, is not a curse. It's a prerequisite for what he called self-overcoming. The spiritual nausea you feel toward superficiality is actually clearing space in your life for experiences that are worthy of your depth. It's protecting your psychological energy from being wasted on interactions that give nothing back, conversations that lead nowhere, relationships that remain forever on the surface. Your repulsion serves what Nietzsche called the economy of the spirit, the wise allocation of your limited psychological resources toward what actually nourishes your authentic being, rather than what merely fills time or meets social expectations. This is why superficial people often find individuals like you intimidating or difficult. Your refusal to engage with meaningless topics, your insistence on authenticity in relationships, your inability to pretend that shallow things satisfy you, all of this challenges their comfortable assumption that surface-level existence is not only sufficient but preferable. Nietzsche understood that this dynamic creates what he called the problem of communication between types. People who live primarily on the surface literally cannot understand why anyone would want to go deeper. To them, your dissatisfaction with superficiality seems like a character flaw, an inability to appreciate simple pleasures, an arrogant rejection of normal human connection. But Nietzsche would say they have it exactly backward. Your philosophical disgust towards superficiality isn't a rejection of human connection. It's a demand for real human connection. It's not an inability to appreciate simple things. It's an insistence that life offers something more than simplicity. It's not arrogance. It's what he called the modesty of depth, the recognition that you are capable of more than surface-level existence, and therefore have a responsibility to honor that capacity. The people who experience this repulsion most intensely are what Nietzsche called philosophers by nature. Not necessarily people who read philosophy professionally, but individuals whose psychological makeup compels them toward what he termed the questioning life. These are people who cannot help but ask deeper questions, who cannot accept easy answers, who cannot pretend that surface-level explanations are sufficient for understanding the complexity of existence. For these individuals, superficial conversation isn't just boring. It's a form of existential violence. Every moment spent pretending to care about trivial matters is a moment stolen from the pursuit of what Nietzsche called the great questions, the fundamental issues of meaning, authenticity, and human possibility that give life its depth and significance. Your terrible repulsion is actually your soul's way of protecting your capacity for what Nietzsche termed creative solitude, the kind of alone time that isn't empty or lonely, but rich with possibility, pregnant with insights, alive with the kind of thinking that can only happen when you're not distracted by the constant noise of superficial social interaction. This is why many deep people find that their best ideas come not in conversation with others, but in quiet moments of reflection, in long walks alone, in hours spent reading or writing or simply thinking. Nietzsche understood that profound thought requires what he called the silence of the depths, mental space that cannot exist when your consciousness is constantly being pulled toward the surface by social obligations and meaningless chatter. But here's what makes Nietzsche's perspective so revolutionary. He didn't see this as a problem to be solved through better social skills or attitude adjustment. He saw it as evidence of psychological evolution, the emergence of human types capable of more than the comfortable mediocrity that satisfies the majority. Your spiritual nausea towards superficiality is actually a sign that you're what Nietzsche called a bridge to the future, an individual whose psychological makeup represents humanity's potential for greater depth, authenticity, and meaning. You're not failing to adapt to superficial culture. Superficial culture is failing to rise to the level of your authentic being. This understanding changes everything about how you relate to your own social discomfort. Instead of seeing your existential revulsion towards shallow conversation as a personal failing, you can recognize it as what Nietzsche called the conscience of quality, an internal standard that refuses to accept less than authentic human interaction. When you feel that familiar nausea at cocktail party small talk, when you find yourself physically uncomfortable in conversations that never move beyond the surface, when you choose to leave social gatherings early because they feel spiritually empty, remember, you're not being antisocial. You're being what Nietzsche called selectively social, choosing to invest your limited social energy in interactions that honor the depth of your being rather than requiring you to betray it. The philosophical disgust you feel is actually terrible only from the perspective of a culture that has forgotten what depth looks like. From Nietzsche's perspective, it's beautiful. evidence that something in you has remained uncorrupted by the shallow expectations of mass society, proof that you've maintained what he called the aristocracy of the spirit in an age of spiritual democracy. Your discomfort with superficiality isn't a bug in your personality, it's a feature. It's your soul's way of ensuring that you don't waste your limited time on earth engaging with people and ideas that cannot meet you at the level of your authentic being. It's your psyche's protection against what Nietzsche called the great leveling, the cultural pressure to reduce all human interaction to the lowest common denominator. This protection comes at a cost, the cost of what Nietzsche called spiritual loneliness. But this loneliness, he insisted, is not empty. It's full of possibility. It's the price of maintaining your capacity for what he termed dangerous thoughts and noble feelings in a world that has largely abandoned both. When you choose depth over superficiality, authenticity over performance, meaningful solitude over meaningless socializing, you're not missing out on life. You're refusing to accept a diminished version of life. You're insisting on what Nietzsche called life at its highest potency, rather than settling for the comfortable mediocrity that satisfies most people. Your existential revulsion towards superficialities is actually your soul's way of protecting something precious, your capacity to be genuinely moved by beauty, truth, and authentic human connection. In a world that has largely traded these things for entertainment, comfort, and social approval, maintaining this capacity requires what Nietzsche called the courage of solitude, the willingness to be alone rather than compromise your authentic being. So when you feel that familiar repulsion at shallow conversation, when you choose books over parties, when you prefer the company of your own thoughts to the chatter of people who never say anything real, remember, you're not antisocial. You're what Nietzsche called a free spirit, someone whose psychological makeup makes it impossible to accept anything less than authentic existence. You are the keepers of depth in an age of surfaces. Your spiritual nausea towards superficialities isn't a character flaw. It's evidence that something in you has remained faithful to the possibility of profound human experience. And in maintaining that faithfulness, you serve not just yourself, but the future possibility of a culture that honors depth rather than fearing it. In the comments, tell me, when did you first realize that you simply couldn't tolerate superficial conversation anymore? What was the moment your soul started demanding depth over shallow social performance?